starting right now on ABC's This Week. Airstrikes.
I don't think we're going to solve this problem in weeks. I think this is going to take some time.
U.S. fighter jets back in the skies over Iraq, dropping bombs to protect American citizens and prevent a humanitarian catastrophe. Breaking details on the dangerous mission. Ebola emergency. The latest on the desperate effort to contain the growing outbreak. Are we prepared for a new virus threat? Plus, game changer. The NCAA told it must allow athletes to be paid. Will college sports ever be the same? This morning, an ABC News exclusive. The president of the NCAA here live. From ABC News, This Week with George Stephanopoulos begins now.
Good morning. Great to have you with us. I'm Martha Raddatz. We begin with the latest on the new U.S. mission in Iraq. This weekend, more U.S. airstrikes against ISIS militants, plus new airdrops of humanitarian aid to help thousands of civilians trapped on a mountain by ISIS fighters. And just overnight, the UN telling us at least 15,000 civilians have been able to escape. Meanwhile, President Obama is warning U.S. military action in Iraq is a long-term project. Chief White House correspondent Jonathan Karl has the very latest with the president on Martha's Vineyard.
Overnight, the Pentagon released new information on the latest airstrikes against terrorist targets in northern Iraq. At 11:20 a.m. Eastern Time, fighter jets and drones destroyed an armored personnel carrier threatening an Iraqi minority group. 20 minutes later, U.S. aircraft struck 3 more targets, with a follow-up strike destroying another. At 3 p.m. Eastern, the final target of the day was demolished. President Obama bluntly acknowledged there is no foreseeable end to U.S. military operations in Iraq.
I'm not going to give a particular timetable because, as I've said from the start, wherever and whenever U.S. personnel and facilities are threatened, it's my obligation, my responsibility as Commander-in-Chief, to make sure that they are protected.
A key concern, the U.S. consulate and hundreds of Americans in the city of Erbil, the capital of the Kurdish area in northern Iraq, and once thought to be Iraq's safest city, is now threatened by the Islamic militant group ISIS, fighters whose ferocity the president and his advisors had lowballed.
There is no doubt that their advance, their movement over the last several months has been more rapid than the intelligence estimates and I think the expectations of policymakers both in and outside of Iraq.
President Obama reaffirmed his promise not to send in ground troops and had this message for critics who say the U.S. would be in a better position if all U.S. troops had not been withdrawn.
The only difference would be we'd have a bunch of troops on the ground that would be vulnerable.
The U.S. is also dropping relief supplies to a minority group trapped on a mountaintop. The UN now says more than 15,000 have been rescued, but thousands are still in jeopardy. And U.S. planes are at risk, too, on these missions.
These cargo airplanes, which are not very maneuverable and do not have the same defensive capabilities that, say, a fighter jet does, have to get very low and very slow to the ground, and they have to open up the back, the ramp, and they have to push things out, and so they're actually more vulnerable.
The president is here on Martha's Vineyard for his family vacation. He's already played a round of golf, but White House advisors say that he is closely monitoring military operations over Iraq and receiving regular briefings. He has brought key members of his national security team with him here to the Vineyard, including National Security Advisor Susan Rice. Martha?
Thanks, John. Now let's get the very latest on the ground in Iraq from Matt Bradley of the Wall Street Journal. Matt, give us a sense of how concerned people are about Erbil.
Well, we have to remember that Erbil was a flourishing city that was growing economically over the last 10 years, especially in relation to Baghdad and some of these other southern cities where I am now. And it's not quite clear whether or not the Peshmerga units who are there, these Kurdish fighters, will be able to defend the city. It's come as a major surprise that this ragtag group of Islamist militias were able to make some serious military gains against the Peshmerga just in the last week. So it is a major concern that Erbil could fall, especially considering that these guys are only about 30 minutes away.
But you've got these airstrikes going on. You've got these stranded people on Sinjar Mountain. This is going to be a long-term commitment no matter what, it seems, from the U.S.
That's what President Obama was saying in his speech yesterday. There's no real short-term solution to this conflict. And we could say that this conflict could look like Libya, where the United States' intervention is confined just to aerial bombardments. But really, the crux of the fight is going to have to come down to the Iraqi military, which has fled in the face of the Islamic State militants over the last 2 months, and the Kurdish Peshmerga, who have really shown themselves to be outgunned and outmaneuvered by the Islamic State. They're a formidable military force, and it's going to be very hard to see how the Iraqi army and the Peshmerga are going to be able to win back some of the land that they've already taken.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Thank you.
Now, for more on the strategy in Iraq, General Carter Ham, who commanded U.S. and coalition forces in Mosul, and Christopher Hill is a former U.S. ambassador to Iraq. I want to start with you, General Ham. You know Mosul, Erbil, that area so well. I spent a lot of time there with you over the years. As you look at these small strikes on artillery, mortar positions, can they really have a long-term effect on ISIS?
Martha, I think the initial strikes are already having some effect. A few strikes by the United States, many more by the Iraqi Air Force, which is encouraging. It appears to have at least given pause to the Islamic extremists as they seek to advance toward Erbil and other cities. But much more effort will be required to achieve a positive outcome longer term.
Or a long-term effect. Is there a danger of mission creep here?
I don't think so. The president, of course, has very clearly stated no combat forces, but there remains to be seen how much support the United States is ready to provide, in my view, first to the Kurdish regional government in Iraq and their armed forces, the Peshmerga, but longer term to help, hopefully, a new Iraq government rebuild the Iraqi military.
But you heard what the president said his goals were. Protect Americans, stop the humanitarian crisis, don't allow safe havens, and protect the infrastructure like the Mosul Dam. How can you accomplish that without combat troops, and how long does that take?
It will be very difficult without U.S. ground forces or ground forces of others, which they may be willing to participate. But it really centers around what I think the president is right. There has got to be a responsible government in Baghdad to which a future Iraqi army can be loyal. I think that was the underlying cause for their very quick evaporation under pressure from the Islamic extremists.
And Ambassador Hill, I want to play part of an interview I did with the current U.S. ambassador in Iraq, Steve Beecroft. I did this in January, and even then he seemed to be waving a red flag about the violence there. How concerned should Americans be about what's going on here now?
Well, we have real interest in the Middle East, and we have real interest in Iraq. Those aren't going to go away anytime soon. We should be very, very concerned.
Ambassador Hill, should the U.S. have been paying more attention to Iraq?
Well, first of all, I think people are paying attention to Iraq, but there are a lot of other crises in the world that may have drowned it out somewhat or reduced the bandwidth for Iraq. But certainly, this is a problem that is not just in Iraq. It's a broader problem. ISIS, whatever its origins, it's pretty clear that it is part of a situation in Syria that has metastasized into Iraq. And frankly speaking, although I think an improvement or the naming of a new prime minister not named Maliki might be helpful, I don't think it's going to, in and of itself, solve this problem.
Well, let me tell you something that Hillary Clinton told the Atlantic. She said the failure to help Syrian rebels led to the rise of ISIS. Do you agree?
I would put it a little differently. First of all, the idea that you can arm some rebels and not others, I think, is a difficult proposition in and of itself. I think the failure to focus on Syria, the failure to come up with a political or diplomatic way forward. After all, if Bashar al-Assad were hit by a bus today, there would still be a problem in Syria because no one knows what that country is going to look like in the future. And so the failure to come up with any kind of forward-looking diplomatic plan keeps people out there fighting because they have no confidence that the international community is coalescing around anything. So I think that's the major problem in Syria, more so than the idea that we haven't put more weapons out on the battlefield.
And General Ham, I just want to quickly talk to you. You were the commander of AFRICOM during Benghazi. This certainly has had an effect on the president's decision, according to some senior policymakers. What lessons learned there when you look at Iraq?
Well, the circumstances are very, very different. Of course, there was, at least as far as I'm aware, no indications of imminent attack against the U.S. diplomatic facility in Benghazi. Current circumstance is very different in Iraq, where there is an imminent threat. It's very present. It's known. So the level of preparation, I think, is much more significant in Iraq today than it was possible in Libya in 2012.
Thanks very much, General Hammond. Thanks, Ambassador Hill.